Good morning, everyone. It's a real privilege, actually, to be here and to enhance existing levels of awareness and understanding about domestic abuse on such an international platform. So I'm going to play a very short video. I'm going to talk about some general trends around male victims. I will be sharing my own personal story. I'm not here to distress anyone, but, you know, I would like to be honest and put you in the real-world situation. There'll be some graphic images from the crime scene, so I'll forewarn you about that. And then I'll take some questions from the floor, and please don't worry, I'm here to be asked whatever you want to ask, so don't be alarmed.
Well, who doesn't like a plate of chips?
There are some people who are really annoying because you go out with them and they say, oh, I'm on a diet, and so they don't order chips and things, and then your chips arrive and they go, oh, can I just pinch one? And then they start helping themselves. And I don't know if you ever remember that sketch on Friends where Joey had a girlfriend and she kept pinching his food when they were at restaurants, and in the end he lost it and he goes, don't touch the food. Well, this is worse, because the headline that caught my eye today in the Mirror is woman stabs boyfriend for eating all the chips. And this was a really calculated assault, because he started eating all the chips, so she slapped him, and he continued. So she calmly went into the kitchen, got a knife, and went in and stabbed him. So that's a bit extreme, but I
think there may be deeper problems in there.
I think there could be a few more issues there.
Yeah. Oh no, don't you think it's just about the chips?
Possibly.
Mind you, if there were chips like that.
And then the next day she stabbed him again. Presumably, it was pinching her crisps.
But he's not filed a complaint, has he?
No, they must be in love.
Hopefully they'll get
Oh my word, whatever now.
Don't touch my tea, Isabel, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, so I think it's fairly safe to say that the media is really crucial about raising awareness, and when we look at that, you know, take a step back, what message is that seeking to deliver? What message does it deliver? And certainly you saw there, actually, it's quite hilarious to be a male victim, and I'm going to show you what that's really like shortly. But it's also part of a worrying trend for me. We've had the Lavinia Woodward case, the Oxford student who stabbed her boyfriend with a knife and was deemed by the judge to be too clever to be sent to prison. And actually, just in the last couple of days, we've had a Women's Aid campaign ambassador who received a suspended sentence despite slashing her boyfriend 8 times across the face with a pair of scissors, and he was forced to jump out of a window. He shattered his ankles beyond repair and is now in a wheelchair and uses a mobility adaptation to get around. And of course, what we'd ask you to take away and consider, going back to the video, what would the reaction be if you reversed the genders and we were quite hilarious that a man stabbed a woman over a plate of chips? So let's just put into context what I'm going to be talking about. You know, I recognise that more victims of domestic abuse are female. But what I'm here to talk about, yeah, but bear with me, that more victims of domestic abuse are women. But what we're talking about here is service enhancements for male victims, and that shouldn't come at the cost of taking services away from female, because what we're looking for is a person-centred response to abuse. Abuse is abuse, violence is violence. And if you go onto YouTube and just Google violence is violence, you'll see a 2-minute video that was put together in London. It's not that long ago, and I'll leave you to look at that and form your own opinion. So what we're looking for here is a gender-inclusive approach, actually. Just again, a little bit of context. I don't want to overburden you with statistics, but what we see is 1 in 5 victims of forced marriage are male, stalking, revenge porn. So again, are the services proportionate? If we focus specifically on domestic abuse, this is a piece of work I do. I get information from the 43 police authorities. We're just gathering 2017, actually. And what we see here is not only the scale of the problem, the proportion of male victims may be a surprise to you. And of course, behind those numbers, we mustn't forget there are people. There are solicitors, refuge workers, catering assistants, police, nurses, all people. And here's a really good example of an inclusive message. We see the stat for the man, we see the stat for the women, and of course we don't lose sight there are children in the middle, and we know that they're impacted upon by abuse. So here's a really positive example. If there's any Coronation Street fans, I'm not going to ask you to name the character, but just to indicate, when that storyline ran, calls to the Mankind Initiative helpline, which is a charity that supports male victims, spiked by 300%. So the irony of that storyline, it actually beamed the story into many crime scenes up and down the country. So let's talk a little bit about my own situation. I walked out of that completely unmarked, not one broken bone. But I didn't walk from that. So here is the property that I'd owned. And that came around. My partner, Michelle, we were not married. With no children. I'd owned this property for over a decade before I met Michelle, and the police bailed Michelle back to my house. So I then had to take out an occupation order to have Michelle forcibly removed from a property that I owned, and that was my leaving present. So there's going to be some crime scene photos coming up, so just to let you know. So your bedroom, apologies, that's in landscape as opposed to portrait, but you'll see a blood-spattered pillow. There are some claw marks down the wall where I was attempting to get off the floor after one of the numerous assaults. And one of those assaults included an assault with a hammer. As usual, the assaults were because I didn't tell Michelle that I loved her, didn't instigate sex. So she decided to slam the hammer onto my skull. She then slammed it into my ribs, and on the third strike it broke. You may see on that image there's no handle, and I have a permanent indentation of that hammer in my left shoulder. Here again, and bear in mind these are 6 weeks afterwards, so use your imagination not for too long, please, about what I look like at day one. And you may see there's a loss of pigmentation there on the arm, and that was a secondary assault in which I was asked what had caused it, and that was from being branded with an iron. It took Michelle just 30 seconds to inflict the assault that would send her to prison. And indeed, I'm very fortunate to be stood in front of you today with 2 arms. I was retained in A&E for 8 hours, not because of the fractures to my skull, but because I was awaiting amputation of the arm. Thankfully, that was saved. So let me just take you just a little bit briefly into what it was like to be a victim of domestic abuse. If there's some emotion, please don't be alarmed. I'm not here to upset you. It's to show you what it was like. So I've owned my house for over 10 years. I wake up today knowing that today's going to be the same as yesterday, and tomorrow will be the same as today. I know I can ignore Michelle's first 2 shouts. She tells me when it's time to wake up. You know, I used to love getting up early in the morning and going down. I'd make a cup of tea. I'd stand on the back doorstep and smell that early morning air before I started work. But it can never be the same. That morning air doesn't smell the same. Not since I was punished for being happy about the no smoking ban, and I was punished by having cigarettes rammed up my nostrils. Those cigarettes were pushed so deep that I had to remove them with a pair of tweezers. I did so by not looking in the mirror. You see, by now, I've become so adept at getting a shave and brushing my teeth because I don't want to look in the mirror. I'm tired of looking in the mirror with one eye closed. And as that eye starts to heal, Michelle will slam a mobile phone into my cheekbone and fracture it to close the other eye. In 14 months, Michelle undoes 3 decades of lifestyle and career choice. I'm in a vice-like grip, and I stay because of a threat to kill. It's as simple as that. If I leave, her brothers in organised crime will kill me. What I really want is a room full of silence. I want to look at a wall and not see my blood splattered all over it. I want to walk through a door as opposed to being walked into it. My life is not my own. You see, Michelle auditioned me for a movie. She said it would be a love story. What I didn't realise is that I was going to be the lead actor in a silent movie. She wrote the script. She did the camera. She did the sound, the lighting, the vision. And I did as I was told when I was told. So here I am 6 weeks afterwards. Fractured cheekbones. I've had my septum replaced. The first picture, you may see I don't look into the camera. And that's because I don't want to look at what's coming back, because I see the camera as a mirror. I don't like looking in mirrors anymore. Not at this point. So what was the impact of Michelle's 14 months of activity? She was found guilty of causing grievous bodily harm with intent. That was an assault with an iron that took just 30 seconds. She branded my lower left forearm, my upper right shoulder, and between the middle of my back. She then just calmly run the iron under the tap and carried on ironing her clothes as if nothing had happened. 4 counts of actual bodily harm, and as in the introduction, there's the impact. And I could talk about any one of those. The migration was significant. What's really interesting is that the homeless status, I was left by the council to live in a Salvation Army hostel for 18 months. And that came about because I had to claim housing benefit to fund the Salvation Army hostel accommodation. And despite having a letter from the police saying it was a high-risk case that should be referred to a MARC, I was left in a Salvation Army hostel accommodation. Would that happen to a female victim? Whilst Michelle was sentenced in March 2009 and released in September 12, the financial aspect of the abuse took me until October 15, so I was living a financial sentence without all the other stuff I needed to be dealing with. And so when we look at the components on the left-hand side, psychological, physical, sexual, all the components that meet the government definition. Certainly the interesting one for me, and it's something I'd suppressed somewhat, was the sexual side of things. I would tell you I was raped. And what she would do by that is that when I went to bed, she'd wait for my breathing to get deeper. She'd then put the light on in a flash. She'd slam a mobile phone in my face. She would sink her teeth in my head. She would pummel my face to the point where blood would spurt and then tell me I had 5 minutes to be ready for sex. And if after 5 minutes I was not ready for sex, the second assault was more violent. On the very rare occasion that I was able to, I was forced to penetrate. And there's some interesting research around that if you look on the internet. On the times that I wasn't, that just proved I was a lying bee and I didn't find her attractive, and so there'd be a second much more violent assault. Now there's some pinch points, they're called pinch points. So the bail conditions, they came about because the police bailed Michelle back to my house. I don't think it would happen if the genders were reversed. Civil proceedings were really scary, if I'm honest. Thought of coming face to face with her. I had to get an occupation orders to get her out of my own property. I find my own accommodation. So the problem is that the police who bailed Michelle back to the house, their 2 officers stay with me in A&E, and I wake up the next morning thinking I'm in a refuge. Bearing in mind, I'm being pursued. There's a threat to kill, and 2 brothers in organised crime are going to find me, chop me up and put me in a black bin liner. But I wake the next morning. I've got a fractured skull, fractured cheekbones, 3 fractured ribs, 1 eye closed. I've lost 25% of my body weight, and I wake up to the shocking fact that the police dropped me off at a night shelter for the homeless. I was out on the streets, alone, scared, didn't know anybody, with people pursuing me who wanted to kill me. Again, would a female victim be put in that situation? So I have to find my own safe place to stay. The medical attention was another pinch point. So I was having fortnightly visits at home by a nurse for a very rare enzyme condition, and it came to light through a subject access request after the trial that the nurse submitted what was called a patient visit form. And on 3 separate occasions, he'd asked Michelle about the injuries, and she confessed to causing them, but he didn't report it. What would a nurse do if he was visiting a female patient who said, yes, my partner's raping me? I feel pretty confident the nurse would report it. Environmental health. So the property was in Lincolnshire. The domestic abuse team were calling me remotely, But what was happening in tandem is that I was prosecuted for the damage to the property that I didn't cause, that came about because the police bailed the perpetrator back to the victim's house. What is it that joins all of these organisations up for these errors? Is it that they didn't see me as a victim of domestic abuse because I was a man? Or is it that they didn't see the causes of my injuries, my situation was caused by domestic abuse? So I find myself asking whether we've got this rehabilitation of offender and victim right, but that's perhaps for a different case. Again, just a couple of personal things. Restorative justice, it's not working for victims of domestic abuse. I've gone on to have 2 6-hour operations on my spine from the damage that Michelle caused. And then astonishingly, the same council that left me homeless for 18 months and I scrimped and saved benefits to get a deposit for private accommodation, then removed my anonymity from the electoral roll at a time when Michelle was released into the public. And their response, their resistance, their absolute refusal to accept the responsibility for increasing my own level of vulnerability once again was astonishing. But I stuck to my guns and I sued them and I represented myself and I did it in the courts, and we came to an out-of-court settlement and I gave the money away because it was never about the money, it was dirty money. But that shows the level of resistance in certain areas, and I'll explain why that is, to males who are victims of domestic abuse. Now, I always use this at every talk I do because it's actually really useful as a barometer to the barriers. Every single week I see that headline, 2 women a week are killed as a result of domestic abuse. But it's factually incorrect. Why? Because it's not just 2 women a week that are killed. And I heard a chap called Nick Gazzard. He spoke for 45 minutes about his daughter being murdered at work. His presentation started with when he said goodbye to her, and it ended with him describing what it was like as a parent to walk into a room to see his daughter laid on a slab cold wearing nothing but a white sheet. And I found myself asking, I'm not a parent, but would the parents of those sons on the left-hand side, those brothers, the sons of those fathers, not be able to empathise with that situation? So if the profession is rolling out something that says 2 women a week are killed, and we make a conscious decision to overlook the worst possible impact, what is it we seek? Well, we have a homicide review. Every time somebody's murdered, we have a homicide review. What could we have done differently? What information can we share? And so, not unreasonably, if for one awful moment you imagine that was your brother, your son, or your father who was one of those people, what would you expect to see? Here's what you're going to get. The government wants to end violence against women and girls. So is it either saying that violence against men and boys doesn't exist? We know that's not true. So it's not as important. We have Clare's Law. And Clare's Law is a gender-inclusive piece of legislation that allows you to ask a question of the police about anybody who you're worried about, who may be in an abusive relationship. And again, under freedom of information, what we're seeing is that men are simply not taking advantage of that, and the members of the public are simply not taking advantage of that legislation. The Home Office took the stance that it wanted to learn from our adults to educate boys and girls, and it did a targeted approach. But again, if you look at the awareness literature, every single poster depicted a young girl being abused by a young boy. So again, what message are we seeking to send out? But what people say to me, and I respect, there's an opposing view that domestic abuse is gendered. I don't agree with it because it doesn't stand up to the evidence. If it's gendered and that's the backdrop to these policies, then how do we support a white ribbon campaign? Because the very same people who are behind that want to end male violence against women and girls. So if domestic abuse is gendered, they've immediately marginalised these poor females in same-sex relationships. So that philosophy doesn't stand up to the evidence test. So, what do we want to see? For me, it's about a person-focused response. What that will do is it will meet with any individual who's abused. It will identify the scope of need. It will place them at a certain level of risk. And if it's person-centred, we can then look to have a consistency of response. And so I'd call on the professionals, if there are any here, if you were to undertake a journey and find that 2 females of domestic abuse with the same scope of need were treated differently, and the only difference was that one of the females was in a same-sex relationship, what would the reaction be? If you repeat that, and you find that 2 females are treated differently, and the only difference is that one is from an ethnic minority, what would the reaction be? And then, of course, you repeat it and look at the disparity of support for male victims compared to female victims. And the position I adopt, shouldn't the appetite be the same to address that disparity? Because at the end, they are all victims. First and foremost, they are all victims. So what I'll do now, before I sort of throw it open for questions, because we've got through that and we're okay for time, just a couple of repeat traits, because again, I want to take you into that situation. So for Michelle, I would describe Michelle as an attention-seeking addict. The first 3 months of the relationship was normal. She was 5'1" and 7 stone. I was almost 6 foot actually, although I would lose 2.5 inches in height off my spine because of the damage she caused until it was corrected. I've got about 1.5 inches of that back. But come on, how could she possibly overpower me? Well, what she did, first thing she did was she built me up to be a king. She was always expressing how much she loved me. She said, you don't smoke, you don't drink. Previous boyfriends would say they'd taken me out for a meal and wouldn't turn up. You know, you're honest, etc. And then she pointed something out that was genuinely true. And here's an example of her manipulation. It was absolutely true that if I lent money to friends, I'd never get a deadline. And I now realise from watching Judge Rinder, I actually shouldn't have done that, but that's by the by. She'd say to me, Ian, people are taking advantage of your good nature. Look, just lend them the money. And I don't want to see you taken advantage of. Just say, I'll need this back when you get paid. And that was fair. But what she was doing in tandem was texting my friends who I'd not lent money to, saying, Ian really needs this money back. So they began to question, why would I lie about them? So the calls reduced. And when the calls reduced, I started to become isolated. My father and my brother lived 40 miles away. And once she had isolation, she had control. And the first assault was a question, what was your last sexual act that you performed with your last girlfriend? And she was hoovering up, and I laughed, and in a flash, she unscrewed the hoover and whacked me across the face like it's a rounder's ball, and I've still got the scar to this day. She ranted and raved and demanded to know, and I just made something up. Blood spurted from my mouth, and then she just calmly washed down the hoover pipe and carried on. There was never any remorse, ever. In fact, she would be quite proud in the injuries she'd inflicted to my face, to the point where she would always send me out to buy some cigarettes. So then surely why didn't I just tell somebody to call the police? Because she put the mobile phone in this hand and ran me off the house phone so I couldn't speak to anybody. And what was astonishing is that having gone into the same shop for a decade completely unmarked, I'm now going in 3 times a week, but I had a plan. So what I started to do was to look at the sales assistant, and I would pocket quite intentionally some Maltesers or some after eights because I could eat those quickly. And I'd get to the till and just buy the cigarettes. But she didn't stop me or report me to the police for shoplifting. And I was in a silent movie, and it was an attempt to deliberately get arrested. But now the violence is just beyond belief. She's smashed my knees with a magnum of champagne. I couldn't get off the sofa for 3 days. She's boiled a kettle of water and poured it on my groin and said, well, if you thought that hurt, wait until it comes a second time. She will not do that. But she did. So her violence had no boundaries at all. So when the threat to kill came about, my choice was simple. Stay and try to manage that as best I can, and as futile though it was. And I do that by speaking when I'm spoken to and doing as I'm told, because the other choice is to walk out of that door and I'm going to be killed. And I really believed I would be killed, so it was a simple choice actually. So the abuse ultimately took me to the point where I came up with a fantastic plan. I had a plan she could not know. But somehow she must have been able to see in here. Because once I told my neighbours just 2 days before the police turned up, I've got a plan. I knew that my life was unrecognisable. I knew she was going to kill me. So the last bit of control I could take back was to blow out my own candle. And I planned it. And I was excited to plan it. Because I could take my own life on my terms, pain-free. That was the psychological abuse. By now, I'd lost 25% of my body weight. But I swear to God she saw inside my mind. She couldn't know I'd shared that. And the very same night she told me, tonight's going to be different. You will not wake up tomorrow morning, I'm going to kill you. And the assault lasted about 6 hours. A metal bar, a hammer, which you've seen the impact of, and her intent was to kill me that night. Thankfully, she fell asleep through exhaustion. She repeated her normal acts, which was to send me to the shops. Thankfully, somebody in the neighbourhood saw me in such an appalling state that they contacted the police, and the police turned up. And the rest, as they say, is history. So, I just want to thank you for your kind attention, and if you have questions, again, please feel free to go in whatever direction you want with a question. I'm here to help you so you can take this conversation back into your community and progress it. Pop your hand in the air, please, if you have anything. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you.
I think when you showed the stats between domestic violence against men and domestic violence against women, I think it's more like 50-50. Am I correct?
Well, the police is about 1 in 4.
One in
It's what's reported against what happens.
Okay. But I was in police station recently, and I think you can see that the posters are starting to be a little bit more balanced, and I saw posters directed towards domestic violence against men, and I saw a poster being tweeted just yesterday where it was about that emotional violence is also domestic violence, and it was a poster saying she always calls me useless. This is also abuse. So I think a little bit is happening.
Yes, and to say I would recognise that things are getting better, but the pace of that change is inconsistent. And there's certainly still instances, as I'm sure you've heard, where look at what's developed in the media recently. And that's why we've somehow got to get into this position of a consistency of a response. It's really important.
Can I correct some on the figure there? If people go to the Parity website, Parity is an organisation for equality of men and women. They won a case with the Advertising Standards Authority because Women's Aid wanted to put up a banner, posters all over the tube saying more women, vastly more women are victims of domestic violence. And Parity have got the actual figures. And what they've come out with, which Advertising Standards agreed with, was that yes, there are marginally more women victims going to hospital. But ultimately, when they looked at who started the violence and who received the violence, there were about 30% that were started by men, 28% started by women, and the rest, they couldn't tell. It could have been either. Sure. So that's where the disparity lies in those figures. Yeah.
I'll let the people in charge of the mic go.
Hi. Yeah. I think you kind of answered this in the talk, but I wanted to ask you if you could say something to public officials. If a public official tells you that you're a victim of a gendered crime, what would your response be?
It's a really simple one. I'd say what I'm hearing is that professionally you're very content that if your brother, your father or your son was a victim of abuse, you're really content with the response that they would get today, and that wouldn't be the same as they would get for a female. Some hands up. Yes. At the back.
Klaus Zinser. I'm a German father and my child has been abducted to UK in 2009 and I haven't seen him since 3.5 years. Not long ago, I've been put into detention for 2 times, and there are 2 points. One is the allegation was harassment with violence, what I said first, what the police lady did, as 4, and then it came out it's at 2. The lady is not working for the police anymore. Nevertheless, it's on the way to finding me guilty, and now I have 2 points. One is harassment without violence, as 2, is going into the statistic as violence. And the second point, I got it from a Mackenzie friend, that's an article in The Guardian, 7th September 2016, reports statistics on domestic violence by women against men are included on statistics under violence against women and girls. That means they take all the domestic violence in both directions and put it all under domestic violence from females.
Yes. I mean, firstly, just to cement that latter point, it's an important one. The violence against women and girls does include prevalence against men and boys, so that completely throws a veil over those poor people. And also, again, we can trade statistics that the ONS will talk about 1 in 3 victims actually are male. And I think the solution ultimately is we want to look at a person-focused response. And if not, why not? Because the law's there, the evidence is there, it's the application of that that's causing the disparity.
First of all, thank you for telling us your story. Few things have, in my memory, have been quite so harrowing, to be very honest. My question, we've had a lot on the statistics, but to put that aside, what piece of advice might you give to anyone here who may know someone or be in a situation similar to yours? You said your intent was for us to take this message back to our own communities as someone who's been through it. Mm-hmm. If you could tell us all what's the most important takeaway we could take back to those communities?
Well, certainly if you're worried about any person, you do have the opportunity under the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme to make that approach to the police. If you're hearing directly from the individual, they've taken you into their confidence, the guidance I would give you is it's really important to say to that man, I'm taking what you're telling me really seriously, I do believe you. Because we know that being believed is a significant barrier to men reporting. The other thing, of course, from personal experience and from other victims I've met, both male and female, I can assure you that your intervention will be life-changing. Each and every intervention has the opportunity to be life-changing, and as we've seen, it could even be life-saving. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you. Over here?
Yes.
Hi. What facilities are available as far as refuge centres for men, and are any of them government-sponsored?
Well, certainly if you were to go onto the Mankind's website, you'll see some information about refuges, and the honest answer is there's scant provision. And again, the position I would adopt is that we're not calling for the same number of refuge spaces for men as women. What we're calling for is a proportionate number based on the number of women and men that are reporting as a need for refuges. There's just hardly any around. So there's been one opened in Burnley quite recently, house full. And I know again that one of the tasks that the Mankind Initiative perform is every Monday they call around all of the male refuges to see what the capacity is, because it runs a national helpline and it's house full. So this message that men don't need refuge is just a myth. It's simply a myth. Yeah, come this side, yeah.
I was just going to ask, in the media, movies and news stations, we see a lot of seriousness around female victims of domestic violence. Yeah. And maybe we don't see anything, or we see, like your example, making a joke of it for men's domestic violence. Do you think that men sometimes don't interpret their own experience as domestic violence because they don't have examples of it?
Yeah, and again, that's a really important point you raise. We know that partly because of the media, men don't recognise what's going on. And I'm sort of one of the biggest critics of the media. And one of my tasks in 2018 was to speak to every journalist who ran a feature on domestic abuse, but only showed this stereotypical image of a young white woman cowering in a corner and got quotes from female victim organisations, because it paints a very disjointed, factually inaccurate view of what domestic abuse is about. And that does send out a subliminal message to men, who then don't recognise what's happening. Yes.
Hi,
Hello.
Ian. My name is Cassie J. I'm the director of the Red Pill documentary. And I recognized your name, but I couldn't place it.
Okay.
And it's because in 2016, when I was editing The Red Pill, I was compiling a montage of domestic violence victims, and you're included in the film as a news story. But my question is, in the U.S., we have battered wife syndrome as an argument in court where a woman is retaliating against her abuser, and that's excuses her abuse as defense. Did you ever consider retaliating in defense?
Two reasons for that. If I go back to when I was in primary school, teachers told me, playground, boys don't hit girls. That seed was planted. On a serious point, my father was always very in a relationship, be honest, it's okay to disagree, you should never be violent. But for me, in that intimate situation, if I respond, I'll be killed. And that was the reason why I didn't respond. I didn't make any effort to restrain, and that's what I mean by respond. When I've described some of the things that Michelle did, and there was over 1,000 assaults, I would say, in 14 months, I knew if I made any attempt to restrain her, she had the capacity and the intent to kill me. Therefore, she would assault me, and thankfully, when I spurted blood, that was her switch. She'd done. She was happy. So I would inside be praying for my nose or my mouth to bleed or my eye. But that's the honest answer. She'd have killed me. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for sharing today. I volunteer for a father's charity, and we deal with a lot of guys who've been abused. And I remember one case of a guy who quite confidently, when we were talking to him, said he wasn't a... Mike's being funny. He quite confidently said he wasn't a victim of domestic violence and was talking about his home life with her, and at one point dropped in how she'd whacked him over the head with a frying pan. And it was just like, hang on a second, you said you're not a victim, but she hit you over the head with a frying pan. And we had to explain to him how he was. And for him, that was a really light bulb moment. He never considered it. So for you, in your circumstances, how long did it take for you to realise that you were a victim of domestic violence?
Sure. And that's also a really good question, because I would say it evolved, if I'm honest. So first assault, love went out the window. I was a victim of an assault. And even after the police intervened, and I think it was genuinely part of my own recovery because I got no psychological support, first and foremost, I was not to blame. Secondly, I was a victim of crime. The fact it was domestic abuse and I had brown eyes, they were all sort of individual traits. And it was only when it began to be framed in the court process that, oh, so this is domestic abuse. Does that make sense? Yes.
Do you have hope for your future?
Well, look, let me say, and thank you. My life today is unrecognisable from what it was like with Michelle. I don't live in any fear of her at all. I don't wish her any harm. I hope she's got the help that she certainly needed, because she would kill somebody. And I take the view, can't change the past, it's happened, I've dealt with it, but I can change the future. And if by sharing what it was like to be a victim, if that encourages a man or woman to come forward, or somebody to make that inquiry, that can only be a good thing. Can only be a good thing. Okay.
Hi. Looking back, before you moved in together and so on, were there any red flags that you can identify now that would warn people or warn you what she was going to be like in the future?
And I think that was a worrying thing, so I'll be really brief. There was nothing at all. That first assault, somebody hit the switch. As simple as that. As simple as that. But thank you for your kind attention. It's been a privilege. Thank you.